Hey, deserving listeners, we have a very special guest with us today on the podcast, my good friend Ann Blake from Antioch University. We were co-workers that
Indeed.
would chat a lot before and after meetings and during meetings sometimes. And
Yes.
Ann is this really nice but professional, smart, dynamic person, interesting person. She's been on the podcast before talking about Myers-Briggs and Jungian psychology 10 years ago, long time ago. And we ran into each other at Jerry's memorial and talked. And I said, hey, do you have anything you want to chat about to the world? And said, I got a few juicy things. And I always like it when people say that, because I'll throw it out there to people, and often they will say like, oh, I'll get back to you. And then they never do. And it's such a great thing, because I always want to highlight all the intelligence and knowledge and wisdom among just the people that I know.
Yeah.
There's so much wisdom behind the ivory tower doors
absolutely.
that needs to be shared with everyone. And it's a great opportunity for us to talk shit about people that we want to talk shit about before we start recording.
Yes, indeed.
So welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thank you so much. I'm smiling broadly and warmly at you.
Yeah. Another detail that I talk about on this podcast, listeners will know that I'm notorious for my thin skin, not only with students when they would criticize me, but also when listeners or people online will criticize me.
Yeah.
And the one professor that I could relate to that had a similar reactivity, and as another way of putting it is a similar dedication to the experience for students. You don't want them to have a bad experience. You're really dedicated to being a professor. Was you. I always felt like you were the one person that I was like, okay, at least there's another person that takes this as seriously and will have sleepless nights when there's a bad evaluation.
And there's a sensitivity in that, is another way of talking about it.
And
take it seriously.
Some kind of trauma, some kind of perfectionism, some kind of shame, something's going on. But also, I think just an empathy for students and wanting them to have not just a mediocre experience, but like a transformative experience, which it often can be. So anyway,
and so we brought ourselves, which is being vulnerable.
Right. So I don't just show up. You don't just show up and mail it in. We're really showing up, our whole person. If I go to the McDonald's and I order a Big Mac and they criticize the way I ordered it, I'm not going to cry myself to sleep, because I wasn't pouring my life and soul into how I was ordering that. When I show up to class, my all guns are blazing on that thing, So you understood that, and I felt in solidarity with you.
Good.
So
one more thing, and that is in the 60s, I forget who said it, somebody really important said, the political is personal. For me, the psychology is personal.
Yeah.
So I'm always processing through myself. My Jungian colleagues, at least the way they talk in workshops, they're processing through their clients. I'm processing through myself. And so again, that makes it more vulnerable, and for me, more real.
Right, exactly. Yeah, right. And when you operate that way, then there's a lot more on the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're more open and vulnerable and real. Yeah. And you don't shut things off. So what do you want to talk about with Podcast Land today?
So I want to talk today about projection, the everydayness of projection. So projection is taking the things about ourselves, both the too bright and shiny and the too stinky and slimy, unconsciously. We take the worst and the best of those, most of us do, and project it out onto somebody else, which means we see it in somebody else and not ourselves. And I want to talk about the good news about that.
Right, because people use projection colloquially. In the non-psychoanalytic, non-Jungian way. They'll basically be using it in a displacement or a distortion thing.
We export it.
Right. So projection in its psychoanalytic definition is that we have an aspect of self that we don't like. What did you put to it? Slimy or what?
Slimy and icky and bright and shiny.
Something about ourselves.
The two poles. And
we will project it
onto somebody else.
We'll see it on someone else.
And unconsciously we do that.
Right.
But the good news is that we have tells.
Okay.
And so I'm going to talk about those tells today.
To be able to identify when we are projecting.
Right.
Okay.
So one of the things that I observe in our field is what I call disparaging words. And so lots of psychological theories use words for clients such as avoidance, defending, deflecting, denial, justification, projection, resistance, and so forth. I think those are disparaging in terms of it gets us into our left brain and we are distancing ourselves from clients and on some level criticizing them and holding them responsible for things they're really not yet responsible for. Part of our job is to help people be accountable. Mm-hmm. So instead of those words, I use the word protection. So people are protecting themselves. Then my heart swings open, and then I'm empathic, and then I'm still in the juice with them, rather than I stepped back and I'm like, what's going on here? So that's one thing, and projection is one of those words. So instead of judging, which interferes with empathic assessment, then we are more in with the client and looking at the issues from that something happened. What happened that they decided they couldn't be here completely? Yeah. One of the things I love about family therapy, which is your field, is that all the behaviors, and Freud said this too, I almost said Jung, Freud said this too, that all the behaviors are attempts to solve a problem. They're not effective when we have trauma from our childhood that skews our thinking and pushes us back into that hyper protection. But they are attempts to solve a problem.
And this can apply not just to clinician, therapist, and client, but also your spouse or your kids or your coworker. Projection and protection.
All the time. Right. In fact, my dear friend Kirk Honda, when you were giving the introduction of me and you were using some very nice words, I was thinking, and he's projecting at the same time. Because if we don't have those things, we can't see those things.
Yeah, this is how I think of projection too. I'm glad that you see, because not I would say a minority of us see it this way, that we can project positive things.
Oh, absolutely. Both sides of that pole. The yin-yang has both sides.
Right. When we are physically intimate with our partners, it might be a projection of when we were cuddling with our parents.
Oh, absolutely.
We internalized that dyad, that relational experience, and then we recreate it in our intimate life as adults.
We're replicators.
Yeah.
We're pattern makers and replicators. Yeah. And then when some of those patterns, again, get formed so early before our precognition in our prefrontal cortex is going on, when we experience trauma and abandonment and attachment ruptures, then our little mind that's not yet fully on board makes some decisions about here's what the world is like for me.
Right.
And then behavior starts to cluster around those. So the other good piece of news is that we are capable, this is my opinion, of everything. Each one of us is capable of everything, for the good and the bad. And for those of us who are fortunate enough to have good enough parenting is what we call it in the field. We don't say ideal, we don't say good enough, because we're all human beings. When we had good enough parenting, then we decide, I'm making a funny face about that because decide is a pretty big word, but we're more attracted to things that are communal and beneficial for both. I'm not going to remember the interview I saw. I'm not going to remember the name of the interview that I saw this morning, actually, early this morning, about a new book that's coming out. But the guy is talking about morality and sort of golden rule kind of things about this is what human beings could achieve together. And then we all feel good enough. Eric Berne talked in transactional analysis, he talked about I'm okay, you're okay. And then variations on I'm okay, you're not okay, I'm not okay, you're not okay, neither one of us is okay. But I'm okay, you're okay. Again, is that good enough that we strive for? So again, those of us who have good enough backgrounds can make those discernments and not do some of the awful, terrible, inhumane things that people do to each other.
Because of the protections.
Yeah, exactly. So when I taught abnormal psych, I talked about we behave badly because we're in pain. And that's a perspective, and there's certainly some genetic things as well, and some that nature-nurture thing, what we learn, what we're born with. It's a convoluted and still kind of mysterious balancing ratio. And I tend to, as a Jungian psychotherapist, I tend to look at the developmental issues.
Yeah, me too. I mean, not from the Jungian side, but the psychodynamic side and the attachment side. In my practice, I do both supervision and individual therapy. And so in the supervision, I talk a lot about countertransference, which is, again, a form of projection. So transference from the client to the clinician, which is about living through, in a dyad, a variety of relationships with previous person in their lives. And then the countertransference is then the clinician's projection of my unresolved things onto the client. And so the more I know about myself and resolve and metabolize is the word I use, my traumas and my stuck places, and Jung calls them complexes, the better I'm able to then access the energy that goes between us. And so I'm a lot about wondering about what I'm thinking, feeling, sensing, imaging, and then when I get that, then I hypothesize the degree to which that's also true for the client. So I'm using myself as the barometer. Like if you start to feel insecure about yourself as a therapist, then you might, through this quick self-analysis in the moment and maybe afterwards in your own consultation, you might start to wonder, is this a manifestation of my client's own insecurities? I remember 15 years ago, you gave me, by the Xerox machine, this handout that had this all graphically depicted. There's like the client, the therapist, and there's these arrows going like conscious and unconscious.
The Jungian gate, like, we call it.
And enactments and the countertransference and transference and the back and forth. And whenever I think about this, I would say half the time I think about that handout that you said, hey, I'm giving my students this handout. And I kind of looked at it and I was like, oh, I like that. It's in the therapy office, it's a two-person system, both people bringing their relational traumas and positive experiences to the table, unconsciously melding together and affecting both people. And understanding that and using it is the key to therapy.
And so we're monitoring all those vectors. So they're 1, 2, 5, maybe 6. Math is not my strong suit.
The conscious to the unconscious, the unconscious to the unconscious, the unconscious to the conscious. And we're monitoring all of that. And so then what I try to do and what I invite supervisees to do is to say, is it something like this for you? So I don't say, oh my gosh, I'm feeling sad right now. Are you feeling sad? Because then they're going to focus on me and be worried about me and go out of themselves. So you're saying that when you're hearing your supervisee talk about their clients?
When I'm talking with the client.
Oh, your own clients.
I don't say I'm feeling sad. Are you feeling sad? Because one of the two situations that I talk about in terms of my clients, I usually talk only about myself, is a client was talking about some loss. I don't remember what it was, and of course I wouldn't say what it was anyway, but I don't remember. I was flooded with grief. And so I kind of shook me, and then I said, okay, this is mine.
And a specific grief came up for you?
Oh, lots of griefs. So lots of unresolved grieving. I'm flooded with grief. And so then I said to myself, okay, I got to address that later. And then said something like deep sorrow to the person. And boom, the person went down into the affect. So that doesn't always happen, but it did happen that time. But I don't say, oh my gosh, I was just flooded with grief. How are you doing? Is that sad for you? Because that's about me.
You don't want them to worry about you.
That's right. That's right. Or distract from themselves because it's so hard to do that grieving. And if I say an I, they'll just go, oh, how are you doing? And, they won't say it out loud probably. Anyway, so let me get back to some reading here. Let me do some definitions. So I'm a Jungian, not a Union, but a Jungian. I come from Union Town in Minnesota. mining town. So Jungian, Carl Jung, C.G. Jung. So he described projection as everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. There's the key. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. Everyone carries a shadow. That's the receiver, the receptacle for the things that I project outward unconsciously. And the less the shadow is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the darker and denser the shadow is. So then when dark and dense, we mean it controls me rather than I manage it.
Wow.
So then I'm acting out, which we'll talk about in a few moments, not out of my volition, but out of something that's got control of me. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. So my unresolvedness, I don't know exactly what I believe and what I accept, but I do wonder about that energy in the world that when I need to work on something, something presents itself to me. Now, am I looking for it? Am I recognizing it? I don't think somebody is up there managing this, putting people in my way.
Yeah.
But sometimes it seems like that.
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I don't believe that there's a divine puller of strings.
Yeah,
At least
good way to put it.
It's not a useful way of looking at psychology and what we do. So I often will wonder, for example, the biggie is marrying your parent. And for bad reasons. Like your dad was abusive and you marry an abusive person.
Yeah.
Even though you grew up knowing how horrible it is to be with an abusive person.
Or sometimes being the abusive person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it just going with that one example of, oh my God, I'm 20 years into a marriage and this person is abusive just like my dad was.
Right.
I swore that I would never be like my mom and marry someone like this.
Right.
If anyone knows how to identify these people, it's me.
Yeah.
How did this happen? And they get a divorce, they go on a date, and 5 dates in, this person's abusive. What's happening here?
Right.
And it's such a known, at least anecdotal pattern.
Absolutely.
That how does this happen? Because people are smart and they're focused and they're trying to avoid things. And so what's going on there? Because it's one thing to let things go in the beginning of a relationship where you will say, well, it's normal that he's getting upset at the waiter. That's normal because that's been normalized to them. But how did they sniff him out to begin with?
That's right. Exactly.
Like, how did they even know to respond to them or go after them? And I think about this a lot because people ask me this a lot, and it's subtle, and I could come up with some examples of how that could play out, where you could see a certain marker in the way they dress or stand, or on Tinder, the sort of photos that they choose. There's certain subtle cues that they might be in that category of a dominant, aggressive, macho sort of person. So there's that angle, but I think that it's a huge question mark for me, though. And I think an important one, because if we can answer this, at least to some extent, I think it could save a lot of people from repeating the past.
And that energetic transmission that happens too. So one of the reasons I like...
The vibe you get from somebody.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's recognizable unconsciously. Like, I know this. There's some comfort in knowing.
Right.
The unknown is always scary for us, even though it's like some folks are risk takers. There's a better phrase for that. But lots of us are like, no, I'm going to hedge my bets.
Right. The devil you know.
Yeah.
Right. Through all my travels, I identified a few different reasons why we repeat, as Freud and Jung would talk about repetition compulsion.
Yeah.
One being devil you know, the other being trying unconsciously to correct for the past.
Yes.
Which can go well sometimes.
Yes, absolutely.
But can also become disastrous if you choose someone that is so similar to the past.
And when it's good enough parenting, that's what it's supposed to be.
Right.
We're supposed to look for somebody who's got those similar characteristics of kindness and morality and my mother's two of my mother's cousins. Our family is is on an incline in terms of some of the generations were really long. And so my mother's cousins are almost more like her children, a little older than her children. But anyway, one of my grandmother's brothers and his wife were just horrible, horrible alcoholics. They were just fall down drunk people. And it just looked so bodily, genetic somehow. It was not so much trauma based, I don't think, although some of it could be, but they just couldn't help themselves. They just couldn't. And we didn't have AA in those days. And they had 2 daughters. So those are my mother's cousins, and I've gotten close to one of them. The other one died young, unfortunately, in an accident. But I said to her one day, how did you avoid that in your life? Because she had a really nice husband and good kids and grandkids. And she said, literally, my sister and I sat down together and had a conversation when we were late teens, early 20s, and said, we're not going to do that, and supported each other, consciously saying, this is not going to happen in our generation. So sometimes that can happen. Yeah, on their own. They didn't get therapy, and they just had that spunk in them.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like they didn't, but the classic is that they become a workaholic, or
something else. They
have some other compulsion that pulls them away from life, some other destructive activity. But it sounds like that didn't happen. I
don't know them well enough to say none of that happened, but they looked like they had pretty good lives.
Well,
reasonable lives.
Right. Self-awareness. And dedication. And monitoring.
Said together, let's support each other. Not doing that.
Right. Yeah.
Let me do another definition. This is from Paul Young-Eisendrath, who's a Jungian analyst who I like a lot. The projection is the situation in one unconsciously invests another person or object with notions or characteristics of one's own. Feelings, images, and thoughts can be projected onto others. In Jungian theory, as we said a moment ago, we call the projected content our shadow, and I always gesture toward the back of my head in terms of it being unconscious and out of our sight, out of our psychological sight. And Belford Ulanoff is a national treasure as a Jungian analyst, and she writes in a book recently published, Back to Basics. She says, in praise of projection. So sometimes I think, I've got a corner on this. And this is the way I think, and I like the way I think. And then I read something and like, well, on one hand, the good news is somebody else thinks this way too. But hey, this is actually mine. But because other people talk about it, we have to cite them. And between you and me and the audience, I got there first without reading this.
I have a similar thought with EFT, with emotionally focused therapy. That it was emerging in popularity around the time that I was becoming a clinician. And when I talk, people will sometimes say, oh, you're an emotionally focused therapist. And I have said, no, I have the same foundation that they do, or similar. But I had developed those ideas before emotionally focused therapy was not that I don't like emotionally focused therapy, but I don't think, I just feel like I always have to say something that because we're more cousins, they're not my father, anyway, but I get it. I get I understand that feeling.
And because I admire this person so much, it's great that I know that we think alike. So she says, in praise of projection, or at least in defense of projection, it is a normal and inevitable happening in our psyches, both individually and together. We do not outgrow it. So here's the Jungian thing. We don't get cured. We get more conscious and more, I'm actually the driver rather than the passenger. We do not outgrow it, though becoming conscious of this pattern, and in particular what we ourselves project onto others, can change our relationship to it. We become curious. That's a big deal for us therapists about curiosity. We become curious what content and affects we put onto others, why these contents and why onto specific others. So why these contents and why onto specific others. We become merciful, refraining from harsh judgments against ourselves and others, for dumping into the common atmosphere what we avoid in ourselves. That's a lovely phrase. We become patient and invest time and effort to not pollute our surroundings with their undigested rage and lamentation. Now, this is really serious stuff, and I'm smiling broadly because I just love how she says it. And I just agree with this. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, there's some academic writing that every sentence can be mulled over for weeks.
Yeah, she's one of those people for me. We accept this basic process of being human. Jung's insight is immensely helpful here. Projection happens when an emotion, thought, impulse is on its way to consciousness. The first step is projection. So that's the deal. And again, that's my jam, is that there are tells. And so let's talk about the tells.
So I want to ground it just for just a brief moment here for the listeners, that if you want to play along, you can pause the podcast and think about 3 people recently that have annoyed you greatly, especially if you think that other people wouldn't necessarily be as annoyed as you are with them. It could be your partner. It could be someone at work. It could be someone at the grocery market. It could be your father, your kid, whatever. It could be someone in the media, like a politician or a pundit or a celebrity, something where you just had a fair amount of energy around, just like, I can't believe that they did that thing, or it just, once again, and, just jot down, a couple words or a sentence just to, for each of the 3. And then it's possible that that's an indication of this protective projection that Anne is talking about.
So I'm nodding vigorously, and thank you for using the word protection. And you just did what the last 3 pages of this presentation is going to be about. So that's exactly right. And also to pause and look at, and I do the 3. So 3 people that you admire excessively.
Oh, okay.
So the annoyance and the admiration.
Okay.
And then do a little writing about that. And so I can say, oh my goodness, Kirk Honda. Like, he's got his PhD. He's published a book about supervision, which is one of my favorite things. And so I can go on and on about, oh my gosh, Kirk Honda. And then I put myself away and out of peering with you. And that's that projection of my talent as well. I put it onto you and export it from myself.
And is it a protection at that point, or is it just normal life at that point?
Let me just, grab
your tote bag of academia. Actually, but first, let's take a break.
In my calendar, which I keep a hard copy calendar, that's how old I am, in here is Marianne Williamson, who was quoted by Nelson Mandela in his inaugural speech. She says, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure." So that part of the fear, the protection is, well, if I acknowledge the completeness of me, including the wonderfulness as well as the stinkiness, in terms of the wonderfulness, I'm going to have to live up to that, maybe. I mean, I don't have to, but part of the fear of acknowledging the best, shiniest part of ourselves is some responsibility. So that protection is, there was a fear of success dissertation. I forget who did that. Maybe, I don't think Jacoby, but that was a big deal when I was in grad school in the mid 1970s. So that fear of success thing.
Yeah, right. And so you can also, dear listener, think about those admiration thoughts that you have, and think about what you might be trying to protect through that.
So we might as well just go there.
Okay.
So the second piece to making that list and filling it out some is then the next piece of that. There are three parts here. The next piece is to write some sentences. I too am like that in the following ways. So that now we're reclaiming the projection.
For all 6.
Yeah. For the negative ones and the positive ones. I too am like that in these ways. So I too am conversant about supervision, and I'm actually trying to do some writing about that. I am writing about that. And so that that inspiration I can take from your doing it rather than, oh, Kirk did that, but I certainly can't do that. I haven't done it yet, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I put you up on a pedestal, well, then I'm lower then.
Mm.
So I, too, have that interest in that articulateness and some really useful, clear, helpful thinking about that.
And that feels scary to you? That's why you project it? The responsibility?
Sure. I haven't done it yet. Yeah, I've started it and haven't completed it yet. Yeah.
But completing it, or presumably, if that's the goal or the destiny, then the path, at least to some extent, involves facing this projection.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you admire someone without it being protective?
It's the excessiveness. The annoyance gets us out of ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's like, again, Jung's words were, the complex grabs a hold of me.
Right. So if somebody were to run into me at the supermarket with their cart because they weren't looking and I get annoyed, that's not necessarily projection. That's just like, but if I ruminate about that moment for 3 weeks.
Yeah. Or you say something loud and annoying and demeaning.
Right.
Yeah.
Then that points to a complex or a projection.
Yeah. And still, in our projection of both the positive and the negative, it's still true about the other. You are bright and shiny. And you did publish this book about supervision. And that I envy that. That's really what it's about. Underneath that's another part of the projection. The protection is I envy that because I haven't done it yet. And surely I can't. Who do I think I am that I can also contribute to the field?
Right. By the way, Anne was famous for her self-disclosure as a professor. It's what makes her so powerful and relatable.
Thank you.
And lovable.
And got me in a lot of trouble sometimes.
Right. We were talking about that.
Once in a while it got me in trouble. Yeah, but it's worth it.
Well, yeah, because for some students, it's hard. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, I thought I was just going to be here learning facts, not having to deal with humanness and emotion and realizing that my professor is a human being with vulnerabilities. I want you to be perfect.
That's right. Because my parents weren't perfect, so I want you to be perfect.
Right.
So the first part is making a list of those things that annoy us in others, those things that we overly admire in others, so greatly annoyed. And then the second one is saying, and I too am like that in the following ways. And then the third piece of that is wondering with great compassion about the genesis of that. What does that remind me of? How is that familiar? Whose voices are in my head that are telling me that I'm not good enough, or that I'm a victim always? Somebody's always doing something that's irritating and gets in my way, or people are always better than I am. Mm-hmm. So whose voices are those? Where did that come from? Because we don't come out of the womb that way.
No.
That's learned behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those are the hallmarks for therapy. You know, there's, sounds like your dad talking.
Yeah, exactly.
And for self-awareness, it's like, that's my mom inside my head right now. Yeah.
So let me talk about my grandma a little bit.
Okay.
So my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, incredibly bright woman. My mother was getting her master's in teaching kids who had learning disabilities. And so part of that, like my training and your training, we learned how to do the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which was part of my dissertation. And so she was giving the intelligence test to my grandmother, who just went on and on and on, like in definitions and problem solving. She was just off the charts bright, and bright in a schooling kind of way, which is what the Wechsler tests. And because my grandmother was so bright, she thought that what she thought and what she decided and what she knew should be accepted by the rest of us. So I remember a very specific time. I was old enough to drive, so I must have been 16 or older. And she lived in my hometown as well. I lived in her hometown. And so I came over to do her an errand. And she told me, this is a town of 25,000 people. It's a little tiny town. Hibbing, Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Yeah, the iron ore capital of the world. But and so we have open ore pits and slag, which we thought was beautiful, dumps we called them. Anyway, it's a little town, so I know my way around this town. And she told me exactly how to drive with pretty big insistence. Here's how you do this, Anne. Anne Beth, she called me. And so even today, I have much more awareness of it, but still it gets under my skin. When people tell me how to do things, like a friend and I were up in Bellingham and we're going off to Trader Joe's and we drive into this little tiny parking lot. She said, there's a parking space right there. And my first response is, do you think I'm too stupid to find a parking space? It's such a big thing for me. I mean, I know it. I talk about it with friends, and they say, why do you react that way? I said, well, number one, I don't need to be told where to park. Yeah. I mean,
It's annoying to anybody, but particularly annoying to you.
Really annoying to me.
Yeah.
So that's an example of that projection of.
Yeah.
And specifically, my thinking that means that I'm stupid and incapable. And that's a big deal.
That's the way you felt.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the way your grandma felt growing up.
It's hard for me to imagine her feeling stupid. But anyway, and then, so that's an example of that negative projection. And the cues, the way we know that we're in projection, because this is not rocket science at all. So the bell-shaped curve, I got one here because it's pretty. So this one says 68%, usually it's more like 74 or 75%, is just normative. So the bell-shaped curve is used to measure like height and weight and intelligence. And over a large population of people tested, we even out. So most of us fall under this big cap, and then the sides go down slowly, and then boom, they go out into these little tails. Right. And the little tails are the things there are people who are taller than anybody else, and people who are smarter than anybody else. So those are those tails on either side. So people who weigh more than anybody else, people who are not as smart as anybody else. So, but most of us fall in that underneath that broad curve. And so when I am beside myself, when I don't recognize my behavior and other people don't recognize behavior, that means I'm in projection. That means I am stuck in something that is under my craw, under my skin, pebbles underneath my feet and my shoe, that I'm just annoyed, or I'm subservient and obsequious in terms of that positive countertransference or transference to somebody projection. So that's recognizable in ourselves. So when I see my overreactions, sometimes my underreactions, my sister calls it I pull the shade. I just go away. It's like, this is nonsense. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. That's also a projection. So when I'm overreacting or underreacting, that's the cue. And I know something's going on in me.
And it takes a lot of self-awareness to identify that, because at first glance, our reactivity is justified and normal.
We think it's,
Everyone with half a brain would react this way.
Yeah.
Of course I'm reacting this way.
Yeah.
And that's where therapy comes in, because it can ask questions that can illuminate what is different.
Or our good enough friends say, what's going on with you?
Right.
What just happened is such a good question to interact. So when I get into my thing, if someone would say to me, what just happened? Then I'm curious.
Yeah.
I'm not defensive. I mean, I could be defensive, but it's a stop and get curious, like, oh, why did I scream out into those little tails on the end of the bell-shaped curve?
Right.
Yeah.
And a differentiation of, I'm going to look at myself now.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not just going to operate as if this is the truth.
Yeah.
I'm going to look at myself. And maybe it is fine that I reacted that way.
Yeah.
But that pull away from ourselves, looking at ourselves, gives us an opportunity to see that. Yeah.
And when I'm beside myself, then I know that something's going on. And we call those process comments, both in terms of therapy and in the world. And we don't have permission in the world, although we should have permission. We don't have permission to say, what just happened there? Or it's not what you're saying, it's the tone. When we say tone to people, they get outraged.
Yeah, I learned that the tough way. I posted a little video on TikTok about tone because in my couple therapy sessions, it's a frequent topic. People will come into my office having had a fight the night before, and I'll look into it. And part of it, if not a majority of the fight, was about tone. About like, you said that, but that was the verbatim, but you didn't say it in that way. You said it in a judgmental or angry or punitive way. And then universally people will either say, no, I didn't, or, well, what's the difference? You know, and it's all the difference in the world. So having tone and awareness of tone, and so I work with couples a lot because it takes a long time to become aware of tone, to be humble about your, you know, like recording a fight and actually listening back to it. Often, if not universally, you will hear yourself and go, my God, I have tone.
That's right.
I had no idea how much tone, bad tone I have. I thought I was being neutral, but I'm so like critical in that tone. And, you know, it's a big part of helpfulness in relationships. I talk about it on TikTok, and like there's all, at least from memory, talking about the thin skin again, all these comments about just like, when people tell me to watch my tone, I tell them to fuck off or whatever. And because, you know, certainly you can use the tone conversation in a uncool way of just like someone's reacting normally and you say, hey, watch your tone. That's not cool, right? So I think a lot of people have some issues with that stop them from looking at themselves.
And that's the clue to be able to look at self, and that we're projecting something. We're projecting something that is unmetabolized, uncompleted, undigested in ourselves, some emotional something or other. And in couples, it's probably about mom or dad. No matter the composition of the couple, and no matter whether we had both a mom and a dad, or two moms or two dads, or just one of either one, we still got stuff about parents.
Right. Anytime you run into this, a good starting point is, did this come from my parents?
Yeah, exactly.
It might not have, but it's a good starting point.
Well, there's that phrase, if it's not one thing, it's your mother. And of course, if it's not one thing, it's your father. So, we have such a protracted dependency, we human beings, as contrasted to other animals.
Yeah. Never ends.
Right. A lifetime. Lifetime. So let me glance down here. So again, beside myself, different from my persona, which is the way I present myself to the world, different from my personal self-image, different from the usual expected behavior or interactions, being beside myself or outside myself, and different from my usual interactive behavior.
Let me ask you about it. If you had not become a psychologist and a professor and a supervisor and a clinician.
And a professor emerita.
And a professor emeritus. Emerita. Is emeritus, is that
Emerita is the female.
Okay, emerita. For you, if you hadn't done that, would you know when you were beside yourself? Because it's a hard thing to get used to.
Right. I can't even imagine. I'm not. I won't. Even imagining. I got into therapy when I was 26. I'm still in therapy at 79. That's a lot of years of therapy. Most recently, I've been with the Jungian analyst for 33 years. It's just such a comfort and an annoyance sometimes, and such an integral part of my being. As I was saying earlier, that for me, the psychology is personal, the way the politics are personal. I just take it so seriously. And I've got some sensitivity. And so that processing with another person is really important to me. So I feel so fortunate. I come from a mining town. Luckily, my family members on both sides were really bright people and valued education. And because the mine moved the town twice, the second time the town said, you owe us something, and they built, I'm so bad with numbers, but let's call it $1 million high school in 1918-ish, and then invested in really good curriculum and instructors. I went to a public private school, a public prep school. And that circumstance that evolved out of who knows where, my mother came back to that town after she was in Washington, D.C. during World War II and met my biological father, Came back to that town. So we have this incredible education possibility.
So you might have known regardless.
Maybe. There's a movie called Northern Exposure.
North Country?
Yeah. So Charisse Theron,
Yeah.
that's my hometown.
Oh, really?
That's my hometown. Bawabic, but that's the next town over.
Huh.
I could have been her. I could have worked in the mines and gotten all kinds of crap and sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Yeah, that could have been me.
Huh.
And my family had some different circumstances. I'm also white, which is a privilege beyond privileges.
Yeah.
So there was no question that I could if I wanted to,
Yeah.
both with the color of my skin and the genetics that I inherited. There was no question that I could do what I wanted.
Yeah. But it's interesting to think about if you hadn't fallen into this career, if you would be as self-aware and so quick. Because for us, with this type of therapy and mindset and philosophy and personal credo that you and I have, which is similar, we want to be as quick as we can possibly be to recognize our being outside of ourselves.
Right.
So that when we're in front of our clients, we don't have to take a break and contemplate. We can right then in half a second, as we are empathically listening
practice,
totally, you know, on our game, the back of our mind immediately, because it's done it thousands of times, goes, oh, there's that thing.
That's right.
I know the feeling. I know, you know, I have it all mapped out because I've done it before.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I can now know what to do with that so that I don't screw things up or harm myself, you know, get burnt out or something.
Right.
But at the very least, don't harm the client. So to be able to do that takes tremendous practice and pain.
And
you know,
commitment.
Yeah. And annoyance, you know, you talked about having been frustrated with your Jungian analyst.
Yeah.
I think about a very important time for me was in my 20s when I was, you know, getting very serious about being a client in therapy. And half the time I would be going to therapy, my hands would be sweating because I'd just be thinking, oh God, I have to face that side of myself that I'm ashamed of and I don't like. Yeah. This isn't going to feel good. Right.
I still have dread.
Yeah. And
when I go to my own analyst,
it's so easy just to mail it in as a client or to say you feel like you're done and you want to take a break. It takes a lot to rise to the occasion and push through it without any concrete benefit. You just have to go on faith that it's worth it, you know, and it is. But it's just interesting to think, like, who would have Anne Blake been if it weren't for that?
Well, so Jungians are, one of the things we think about is synchronicity, which is more than a coincidence. So it's like, again, it's not somebody pulling the strings from up above, but it is being awake enough to recognize when it happens. So when I was probably in 9th grade, some class, Mrs. Lundeen was teaching it. I had 4 incredible female instructors when I was in high school, and I graduated from high school in '62. So this is like a long time ago, and they were all a little bit older. In high school, Miss Scott taught math, which I'm not great at, but I got up to trig, and she made it possible. And this one teacher, Mrs. Lundeen, there was also a Miss Lundeen. Mrs. Lundeen gave us a assignment of writing about a profession, a career. And the Mickey Mouse Club was big in those days. And one of the segments was a little girl and a little boy, and they were, I think it was TWA, and they got their little uniforms. And of course, the girl was an attendant, and the boy was a pilot. And so we had to hand in a piece of paper saying what we were going to write on, and I said an airline attendant, stewardess we called them in those days, and she called me up to her desk and said, no, you write about a profession. And that flipped me. And so even though, yes, I was going to go to college, and my family was, my dad said I couldn't go into the service. I don't know where I got that idea. But people were teachers in my family that I didn't pay much attention to. But that shifted my trajectory. Mm-hmm. So sometimes those things that fall on my path that I'm not expecting, but I paid attention to her. I mean, I had no choice. I had to do something because she told me to.
But there's a message, which is
Yeah.
that she believes in you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and there's nothing wrong with being a steward.
No.
Steward and stewardess. I know lots of friends who are, and they've had great lives. It just wasn't for me.
Mm-hmm.
I actually did my paper on journalism, and I didn't go into journalism, but I like writing a lot, as you know.
And
Yeah.
looking into things, people.
Yeah. And I was always a questioner. So sometimes things just didn't make sense to me. And I wondered aloud about them, or I certainly wondered inside myself about them. Yeah.
Yeah, I annoyed my family with a lot of questions.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's take a break here.
Well, let me look at my notes here and see, what are we doing with time here?
Well, there's no time limit.
Okay. Well, let's see. So you knowledgeably and empathically and synchronistically
Yeah.
came up with that thing about, okay, write down some things about people you are annoyed by and people you admire a lot. And so this last thing here, it doesn't have to be the last thing, but again, the good news about this unconscious mechanism, a protective mechanism, is by protecting our behaviors and characteristics, projecting our behaviors and characteristics onto external sources, so we export them, means that the information is no longer, at least in that moment, instant situation, unconscious. Because I just did something that I can see and other people can see. And again, if I take it seriously enough and I'm invested in trying to figure myself out and being as authentic a person as I can be, then when I go off the grid, it catches my attention. So then it's no longer unconscious, rejected, or hidden, my unconscious. The information is accessible outside of us. And when we recognize the cues, we are able to get into a conscious process to integrate those personal behaviors and characteristics. So the goal for all therapeutic methods and orientations, theoretical orientations, is to bring all of the person into presence. So I think of it as a three-dimensional sphere is what people are. And so the more I integrate all of the pieces into me, the yin-yang, I don't tattoo, but if I did, the yin-yang is so important to me in terms of, number one, it's a circle rather than a square, and the dividing line is curved rather than straight, and then it's got the dark and the light and the dark. I mean, it's just so fantastic as an image. And so that piece of incorporating all of that into us and knowing all of us have bright and all of us have dark, and there's a dot of the other in each.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I can think of something for myself to walk us through this. I'm trying to think who has annoyed me recently. Online or in my real life. Well, let's see. Being married, there's always something that comes up, right? Oh, well, the other day I had my family over for a joint birthday party, and I was there. We play this game in my family called Spoons, and it's this fun kind of chaotic card game where when someone gets four of a kind, everyone reaches out for a spoon. It's sort of like music chairs.
Oh,
where
yeah.
if you don't have a spoon, then you're out. So it's a fun, chaotic.
Yeah.
There's a lot of laughing and oh my God, and we were about to play in our dining room, and I was removing things from the table so that we could play, and my sister said, "Oh, do you want to put something down to protect your table?" And I had just a quick thought and into it and thinking, yeah, it'll be fine. I just kind of made this face like, it'll be okay. But, there's metal spoons. There's a lot of grabbing and, wrestling away of metal things on top of a dining table. And it's, it's a newer wood and it didn't look like it could really handle that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm the sort of person that I'm like, look, tables are meant to be lived on, and they're going to get dinged, and you can't live your life constantly worrying about that. I don't really care. And so I just made this little face, and then my wife, Stacy, she said, well, no, you should get a tablecloth. And I had this split second of similar to, hey, there's a parking spot.
Yeah.
Of just like, ugh. And I can't really identify what I was upset about, because it's, I got a tablecloth, put it down, and it made it actually a lot more pleasant. When you got a tablecloth down, it just feels nicer to the touch,
Yeah.
And I thought about it later. I thought, like, what is that exactly, and why? I mean, my wife just suggested something that was right. It was a better option, and I don't care. The tablecloth was, 3 feet away in a drawer, and it ended up making things better for everybody. Why did I get that irk? That sort of don't tell me what to do, and it's my wife's table too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
But it's this projection of, I don't know, control or nitpick or criticism or having to share authority, maybe.
Yeah.
Because it's not just my space, it's her space too. Yeah. Saying it in front of my family could be a thing as well. And then I have to look at the slimy aspect of myself of being controlling or dominant or invasive or critical or humiliating to others in a way.
Or even
harsh.
Caring about things. Because there's a part of you that says, it's okay, there's no problem. There's probably another part of you that cares about things.
Right.
And maybe you even question how much you care about things.
Right. Like a conflict, a complex around caring about possessions or about the longevity of items or something. We all have traumas about that, right?
Sure.
You, as a kid, will be rambunctious and break a vase in the house or something, or you're driving your dad's car.
That's what I was thinking.
And you take a corner too fast and run into the curb and break the axle and flatten the tire. To just name a random example.
Ouch.
And then
ouch,
to be, my parents were not nice enough about it, but the worry, probably the worry before getting home that day was bigger than the actual, consequence. But that feeling of, wait, so I'm irresponsible and I don't want people to hold me to those standards, or I want to be flippant and free from those kinds of demands, And come to think of it, like I do kind of have a complex around that, like when people in my life will break something or a guest in my house will damage something, I am like militantly, it's okay. It's just a thing. Like I'll have thoughts, like I'll be having a party or something and people will be coming over and I'll have a thought like, oh, maybe I should move that thing so it doesn't get hurt. And I'm like, no. If my friend's kid breaks that thing, you need to be front and center and say, it's fine. It's just an object. I don't care.
So there's going out to kind of those tales.
Right. I'm trying to really plan ahead and compensate. So, so this probably has to do with that. So there's a lot of branching out.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not just my wife saying get a tablecloth. It's a lot of aspects of who I am.
That's how complicated we are as organisms. It's amazing that we learn how to control our bladder and our rectum and that we can walk and talk and feed ourselves. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Given all the complexity of our childhoods, even the ones that are good enough.
Yeah.
Let alone the ones that aren't good enough.
Right.
So I really respect and admire and I'm grateful for your also looking at yourself. And again, it's such a good example, Kirk, of the branches. I think about the EMDR, not the EMDR, Yeah, EMDR, the eye movement reprocessing, in which they talk about the railroad center house that has railroad lines going off in all directions, and they move the cars around and put them in another direction, and that's what happened for you. And the key there was, I forgot it now, but something about on second thought, or on, you had some phrase that went, oops, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, actually, come to think of it.
That was it.
Yeah.
Come to think of it. Then we go, okay, here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the connections happen, and the synapses fire, and
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
that's,
I
that's the
hadn't
process.
really gone down that road
Yeah.
even 5% as I did
Yeah.
just now, and it's illuminating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a calming.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like when we were talking earlier in terms of when something, I'm in a therapy session with a client and something happens to me, and awareness could be an image passing through my mind, it could be a tightening in my body, it could certainly be an affect, a feeling. And I say, oh, that's mine, and I'm going to process more of that later. And then I offer it out as a hypothesis. Is it something like this for you? My system clears. I'm done with that. I still have to process my stuff. But once I metabolize it and offer it out as a hypothesis, then I'm also not invested in, am I right? Is this the right thing? Because clients will either say, oh, yeah, some version, or they'll say in some way or other, not yet. I'm not ready to do that yet. Or I'll just be wrong. But once I metabolize my own, I don't have an investment in being right.
Right.
And so they can do what they need to do in that moment.
You're not tied to it. Yeah.
So there's a freeingness to metabolizing.
Yeah. It feels scary as
Sure.
you step into the unknown, but
Yeah.
it is so much freeing
Yeah.
to, I don't know, we could talk about these feeling that you have when you unearth things, or when you get your hands on something, or when you just admit that you're a human being,
Yes, yes.
and that it's okay,
Yeah.
and someone hears you and
Yeah.
doesn't immediately shame you for it.
Yeah,
It's like,
absolutely,
oh, okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
this thing I was trying to protect isn't
Yeah.
so bad after all.
Yeah. We're smiling warmly at each other.
Well, so is that your shtick of today that you had?
Well, I got one more thing to add in
Please.
terms of what you were just talking about. When I was teaching at full-time at Antioch, a colleague was out for a conference. She was teaching communication and counseling skills and asked me would I step in and substitute for her. Of course we did that. And so this one was about confrontation. It's like, these students don't know me. It's 3/4 way through the quarter. I'm going to come in, the stranger, and talk about confrontation.
Yeah.
And so it took a while for someone to volunteer, because we do role playing. I'm going to be the clinician. They're going to be the client. And so some brave soul came up and said something, and I was struck as though something had hit me in the chest. Some energy hit me in the chest. And I said to myself, you have to say something right now. And I said, but I don't want to. And I said, but you have to. And then I said something. It was just innocuous, but it was just like so energetic and so real and so true, this thing that this person had said. So it wasn't a big deal what I had to say, but to launch into that intimate space really took some courage to do that.
Okay.
And that's what we do as human beings every day.
How'd it go in class?
It went really well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you self-disclose about it?
No, it was in response to what the person said. So
Okay.
some empathic connecting.
Was it a confrontational thing that you said?
No. Well, I mean, everything is a confrontation. So confrontation has a bad rap of something negative. It's just feedback.
Yeah.
And so I said something in response to but what the person said was so powerful
Yeah.
that I had to show up
Yeah.
and say something in kind.
Okay.
In terms of validating and
Right.
yeah.
Right. You can confront through empathy by saying,
Absolutely. Yes, any response.
like, wow, that
Yeah.
sounds really rough.
Yeah.
It's a confrontation because it would perhaps stretch them beyond their typical
Exactly.
pattern of
Exactly.
glossing over it or
Yeah.
not feeling their feelings.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is the best profession, the least boring profession. It's always a mystery. It's always something new.
Yeah.
more often than not, when we hear something, we've heard something like it before, but every once in a while there's something that I have never heard this before.
Yeah.
And that honor that somebody shares something with us that they've never told another human being is just mind-blowing. It's humbling.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so precious.
Yeah. Yeah. The amount of stories that we could tell, particularly you've been in the field a long time.
I'm a lot older than you are.
50 years, 50 plus years in the field?
Let's see, I graduated from grad school in 83.
So 40 years.
Yeah, 40 years, yeah. I got into therapy the first time when I was 26. That's so long ago and so valuable, every moment of it.
Well, Anne, it was great to chat with you.
Absolutely.
And at 79, you're my parents' age.
Oh, my goodness.
Were you young for your class? Because
I was. Yes, I was.
My dad graduated in 62. One of my parents graduated 62,
Wow.
and they're both older than you.
Yeah, I was. I started school early.
By a year.
Yeah,
But
yeah, exactly.
for you at 79, still, I can tell, sharp as a tack. You haven't lost a step to have a full practice?
3 days a week, and that's not full at the moment.
It's
Yeah,
pretty
but still,
close to
3 is
like 3 8-hour days or 6-hour days?
6-hour days.
Okay.
Yeah.
Still.
Still.
I mean, that's
Still.
that's for many, that's a full-time practice.
Yeah.
Certainly can pay the bills with that. And then you have
Absolutely.
your supervision in that?
In that.
In that.
In
Okay.
that. Mhm.
And that you're still going strong and still enjoying it?
Absolutely, or I wouldn't do it. Because I could have stopped a long time ago, but
Yeah.
no reason to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about that for myself. People
Yeah.
talk about retirement. My
Yeah.
accountant started asking me questions about it.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to get the AARP letters in
Yeah,
the
I
mail. And I think, I don't know. I don't know if I would want to. Maybe I'd slow down,
Yeah.
but I don't think I would want to be doing much of anything else.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's other maybe vacations that you want to
Sure.
go on or
Yeah.
projects or whatever.
Yeah.
But
I'm doing more of that. Yeah.
but I definitely, I would definitely miss it. So
Yeah, absolutely.
whether it's clinical work or podcasting, I don't see
Yeah,
myself.
yeah.
So it's just nice to see.
How long have you been doing this?
Just over 15 years.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's a real service to the community, Kirk.
Ah.
I've supervising some students, and one of them said that she knew me before we got connected as supervisor because she'd heard the podcast.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You also had another topic you want to get to at a different time. Didn't we talk about this at Jerry's
So
Memorial?
there's this thing that I discovered in a workshop in 2019. I went to a 2-day workshop about sexism and racism for white women. And an organization here in town. And in that time, they asked us to begin a poem called I'm From. And mine is 5 pages by now. I like to write and I like to express, and that's a lot of pages for a poem. And it's a fascinating, wonderful. And it would be interesting to talk about here because usually it's in a workshop and people are writing and then they give feedback and back and forth. So it's probably not a long conversation, although you and I do long conversations, which is wonderful and great and lovely. But we could easily talk about that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll have to have you back
It's a
on.
lovely format. I would love to come.
Yeah. I mean, all my regular co-hosts are my best friends.
Yes.
Before
Yeah.
they were on the podcast. So,
Yeah.
you get older and it's harder to schedule to get together, and
Yeah.
it's a good opportunity
Yeah.
for that. And I don't get opportunities like today to nerd out on psychoanalytic and Jungian psychology
Right,
stuff.
right,
It's
right.
something that I think about and talk about,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I don't have anyone like Rebecca Bloom, who you know,
Yeah, absolutely.
and Bob Gettle, another colleague,
Yeah.
friend of mine,
Yeah.
neither of them are really oriented in this. I mean, Rebecca will say that she's Jungian to some extent, but
Sure.
she's not steeped in all
Yeah.
of this
Yeah.
technical language stuff
Yeah.
the way that you and I are.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
It's a
a
pleasure.
good opportunity to
Yeah.
talk
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Well, So at the end of every episode, I say, take care of yourself because you deserve it. So, but I'll let you finish why people should. So everyone out there, that's the end of the episode. And please take care of yourself. And why should people take care of themselves?
Because it's good for all of us. It's good to feel authentic and real and whole.
Mm. It is.
And I have little tears starting. So.
Oh, why?
Because it's just so yummy and wonderful and touching and intimate and right.
Yeah.